Hello, and welcome back finally to the Alexander Society. This is a podcast about history and absolutely nothing else at all, not a single thing. Am I right?
I'll drink to that.
Prost. I'm your host, a brooding samurai swordsman with a checkered past and a chip on my shoulder, Derek, joined by my friend and co-host, hard gambler and womanizer by day, elite ninja warrior by night, Tim. How are you doing, Tim?
I'm doing good. I can say I missed our discussions together, if you want to call that the history lesson you forced down my throat.
Yeah, for our listeners, I'm sure you've noticed it has been a little while since we've had one of my episodes out. Just some shit in life. Some shit in life has been happening. But we're back now. We're gonna try and get back on something resembling our regular schedule.
We're going to try and do better.
Yeah. So, Tim, what are you drinking?
Well, Derek, tonight I'm drinking... Let me find my can for a second. Because I poured it into a cup today. I'm being bougie.
Mm.
You remember, one of the first couple times we drank a 30-pack together? And we got those natty Saturdays or whatever it is?
Yeah, I think so.
So I found another pink lemonade beer, but it's a local one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's called Nada Pink Lemonade Sour Ale. And I was just immediately like, heck yeah. And it's by Roughtail Brewing. I'm not sure where they're... I
Haven't heard of them.
either, to be perfectly honest. This is literally the first time I've seen anything from them. And they're OKC Brewery. I also have...
Well, yeah, there's so many breweries in OKC.
Oh, there is. Then, as for my liquor, it is Conatar, something like that. It's supposed to be Irish, I assume. 1014 Irish Classic Blend.
Is it a...
It's an Irish whiskey. I think this is my first Irish whiskey that I bought to be Irish whiskey. I mean, I guess Jameson's an Irish whiskey, but...
Yeah, it's Jameson.
That's why I said kinda not, because it's just Jameson.
Yeah.
What are you drinking tonight, my drunken brethren?
Oh, is that what we are now?
I mean, is there any better term for us?
I guess not, no. That is mostly what we do together. So, I found this vodka. It's a platinum vodka called Core, Khor, Core. And had nothing about it. It's in a really pretty bottle, and it was pretty cheap for what it was. For my beer, since we're doing an episode on Japanese history,
Did you go Japanese beer?
I grabbed something that had a bunch of Japanese on it. It's called Asahi.
Sahi, huh?
Yeah, Asahi, Asahi. And it does have Japanese all over the labels. But then when you look at the label up close, right at the very top, it says product of Italy. So, but it says it's literally described as a super dry, and it's it's just a 5.2. So in this, our illustrious society, the two of us abide by a set of rules. Rule number 1. Every time I skim over a whole ass battle at some point during the story, we take a sip, which is gonna happen a lot. There's a lot of battles in this story.
To be honest, from what I understand about our topic today, I don't know our subject, but I know the period in history. It would be impossible to cover it all, to be perfectly honest. Then, rule number 2, every time our subject changes his name, we'll take 3 sips.
And rule number 3, every time somebody commits ritual suicide, aka seppuku,
we're going to take a shot.
So, you ready to get into it?
Yes, sir. I've been missing this.
So this episode, we're finally going to be branching out of our usual area that we usually talk about. So usually we've been mostly covering the Mediterranean and North America for the most part. So I'm finally starting to try to branch out into areas that I'm less familiar with, and I am the least familiar with specifically African history and East Asian history. So this was an exciting one for me because I had to look up a lot of extra stuff that I'd never heard of before just to get a lot of this context. We're going to be discussing the life and the legacy of one of the greatest rulers, if not the greatest ruler in the entire history of Japan. This guy was a family patriarch, a shrewd political operator, outstanding general, brilliant tactician, and an even more brilliant administrator in government. This guy's name was Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Not a name I've heard before. The only one I've heard from the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period, is Oda Nobunaga.
Yeah, he is going to be a very prominent character in this story. I actually originally wanted to do this episode on him, but I think
That's kind of how I knew what period and like the time place
Yeah.
we were doing it in, because I know you'd mentioned him, but you couldn't find enough on him directly.
yeah, like I could only really find like one good biography of him in the English language, and that book that I found was It was taken out of print in like 2008, and it was only available in hardcover everywhere I could find it, and the cheapest I could find it was like $140.
Good God.
So I kind of I'd like to state for the record, I do not know how to pronounce Japanese names. I'll do the best I can with the English phonetic spellings that I'm provided with, but I am probably going to mispronounce a lot of this stuff, so bear with me.
It's usually fairly close if you're using Romanji. I'm more experienced with Japanese, but I couldn't get anything right either, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, you want to go ahead and start off with our shot?
This week you have to say it with me. Kampai.
Oh, kanpai. I picked out our shot roll for a very specific reason.
Seppuku happens multiple times.
Seppuku happens a lot in this story. So this guy, Tokugawa Ieyasu, by the end of his life, he had fought in around 90 battles in his life. And I mentioned most of them by name. So, like, if we had done that, we'd be dead by the end of this episode.
Yeah?
We've got a good rule set up right now, so let's establish a little bit of background. I tried to make this as short as possible, while still kind of fully fleshing out and understanding what was going on during this time period. So the time period we're talking about here, roughly the late 1500s to the early 1600s, the lifetime of Tokugawa Ieyasu. This was the tail end of a period, like we said, a period of Japanese history called the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring.
Hold on. Are you saying his name the traditional Japanese way, or are you switching it around?
No, it's the traditional Japanese name. His family name coming first.
Okay. I wanted to double check to make sure I wasn't just misunderstanding his name.
Yeah, his given name is Ieyasu, and that's actually how I'm going to refer to him for most of the story.
And here's a little lesson about Japanese names. If you didn't know that already, the surname comes first in Japan.
Yeah. So we're talking about the last few decades of the Sengoku Jidai, and then the Sengoku Jidai was itself the last decades of the rule of the ruling government of Japan, the Ashikaga shogunate. Yeah, so most of the story is going to take place in like the very, very tail end of the Ashikaga shogunate, the rule of the Ashikaga family as the shoguns of Japan. So let's explain some terms a little bit. In feudal Japan, their social structure was relatively similar to one that we can see in like medieval Europe. So at the top of the pyramid of Japanese society, there's the tenno, or the emperor. Prior to the 12th century, the emperor had powers similar to a European king or European emperor. But in the prior few centuries leading up to the Sengoku period, the emperor had become more of a figurehead, serving as a divine authority in order to legitimize the actual political leader of the country, who was the shogun. Yeah, the shogun was traditionally just a military leader who was appointed by the emperor in times of crisis. But back in 1160, the imperial court's power was supplanted by the military power of the Taira clan, and then a couple decades later, that was supplanted by the Minamoto clan. And then from there, under the Minamotos, the shogun cemented his power over the imperial house. So the reason that imperial power waned so badly during that period of time was because of the growing political power of the next rung of the feudal ladder, which was the daimyo.
Which is like I don't know where to compare it to normal one, but that was kind of like their. I want to say Baron is the one I think of most compared to it, but I could be wrong. But basically, they were given areas of land on which they were ruled over in instead of the king, and like underneath the king is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think the closest there's no real one to one because they are kind of different systems, but the closest like one to one you get to like feudal Western Europe would be probably like a duke or a count. Like a count or a duke or like an archduke. Yeah, so a daimyo he was a feudal lord, he was a landowner who would owe military allegiance to the emperor or by that point the shogun. They came they came to political prominence in that period due to the widespread adoption of well-trained mercenary soldiers, which you might have heard of, were called samurai. Samurai they're the next rung on this feudal ladder. Samurai were kind of similar to knights. They were given special privileges and status in exchange for loyal service to their daimyo. They've
Samurai acted, in my opinion, way different than knights do.
Yeah, they were very different in like a lot of their roles militarily from like what a knight would be, but in terms of like their position and status within Japanese society, it was very similar to that of knights within European society.
Okay, I get what you're saying now.
Yeah, so the samurai evolved from this grungy underclass of soldiers for hire and were eventually risen into a respected caste in their own right due to their service to the daimyos and to the shogun during the shogun's ascent to power over the emperor. And then under that you had everybody else, the commoners, who were divided into three categories. At the top, interestingly, were actually the peasants. The peasants were the most important commoners in the country. They made up about 90% of the population. They would either farm or fish, and they would provide profits for whoever their landlord was, whoever their daimyo was. Below them were artisans, guys like blacksmiths, weavers, printers, any sort of specialized craft like that. And then at the very bottom, the absolute scum of Japanese society, spat on and reviled by all, were the merchants.
Interesting.
Everybody? Yeah, the merchants were the bottom, the absolute scum of society. Everybody considered merchants to be parasites on society because they were able to get wealthy and make a lot of money without actually having to do any physical labor like fighting or farming. And so they were considered the most dishonorable people in society.
It makes sense with a lot of the ass backwards stuff in Japan.
Yeah. Yeah, this episode I have a lot of opinions about like Japanese politics and like a lot of the trends in like Japanese culture and Japanese history, things like that. I'm gonna keep them to as much to a minimum while we cover this story as I can. But it is sometimes gonna come up like some of my criticisms about like Japanese work culture or.
Oh my god, don't get us started on that. Because there's a lot of issues with Japanese work culture. Modernly, I don't know a whole lot about the historical work culture, though.
Yeah. And, of course, the big elephant in the room, World War II. I am going to end up bringing that up a couple times. It's just unavoidable talking.
I mean, World War II fundamentally changed the way Japan functions.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to get into it a little bit, too, like how they got to that point. And it kind of sort of starts here. But we'll get to it. So, the dynasty that was ruling Japan at the time of the Sengoku Jidai. Okay, yeah. So, the dynasty that was kind of ruling Japan at the time of the Warring States period were the Ashikaga, who had ascended as the shoguns in 1336. But in 1467, there was a succession crisis. There were two Ashikaga brothers, and one of them was a child. The other one wanted to be the shogun, but he was lower in the line of legitimacy for some reason. I can't remember exactly why. I think he might have been like the son of a concubine.
That's usually why you would be lower in the succession chain.
And so this dispute broke out. All of the daimyons in Japan started taking sides, and there's this big civil war called the Onin War. And a lot of complicated political maneuvering happened. By the end of the war, the Ashikaga were severely weakened, and while they were still the shoguns, they had essentially become puppets to another family, the daimyo of another family called the Hosokawas. And don't worry about remembering these particular family names right now. They're not going to be as important once we get into the main story.
Duly noted.
So the vulnerability of the shogunate emboldened many of the other houses of Japan to begin jockeying for greater influence within the country. And all of this saber rattling and elbowing started growing in intensity until individual daimyos were starting to enter into open war with one another. And so that's how the Warring States period began, was just this slow devolution into basically a century-long battle royale of...
I mean, that's the Warring States period, from what I understand, it would be best summed up by a battle royale, because, like, it was a back and forth across the entirety of Japan. They were very regionalized. There was, like, the way I think of it, I know it's an incomplete thing, is it didn't feel like there was a centralized government. I'm sure there was, quote unquote, but it didn't really function from what I understand.
Yeah, exactly. The influence of the shogun basically completely disappeared outside of the walls of the capital city of Kyoto. Yeah, Tokyo didn't exist by this point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is wild because that was only like 500 years ago, and now Tokyo's the largest city on the planet.
It is?
Yeah. Yeah, both by population and by total like landmass. Tokyo is the largest metropolitan area on the entire planet. They've got 34 million people, I think, somewhere around there. I think the second largest behind them is New Delhi, which has like 28 or 30 million. Yeah, so for almost a century, Japan outside of the capital of Kyoto was a battle royale, with the shogun's seat being the final prize for whoever emerged victorious. And it was impossible. The reason that this period didn't act like a normal civil war is because all of these daimyos were constantly stabbing each other in the back and betraying one another and fighting against one another so often that it was impossible for like factions to form.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know that was... So, is there, for most civil wars, is there a generalized faction that usually gets the most, like...
Yeah, typically, even in like really like a big one to think about is like the Syrian civil war, like over the 2010s. Something you saw with that war was like there were a lot of different groups that were completely independent of one another, that were often fighting each other. But over time, you eventually got them, they were able to like conglomerate into like these larger alliances and coalitions that ended up forming like larger blocks of political power within the country. And you didn't have the same thing happening during the Sengoku period, because like they just couldn't cooperate with one another. Anytime any alliance that any of the daimyos formed would only last for like one campaign, and then they'd immediately start fighting themselves. So you couldn't sustain like a larger coalition or a lot like general alliance.
That's crazy. Like, that's a ridiculous amount of backstabbing.
Right. If you only had like 2 or 3 or 4 daimyos who could all agree to cooperate with one another for longer than like a few years, you probably could have ended that whole period relatively quickly because they would have been completely dominant. But it never happened because there's just some weird quirk in like the culture or the circumstances that all of these warlords found themselves in, that they were never able to trust anybody enough, any other warlord enough to be able to sustain an alliance with them. And so you have like literally a century of this type of warfare going on. It's really...
Is that how long the Warring States period lasted?
Yeah, from right around like the 470s, and it's going to end right around the 1470s, right? And it's going to end right around the 1570s or 1580s.
Okay, so that's relatively close. Dang, I didn't realize it was about it. I honestly didn't know a time range. I assumed it was a couple of 100 years, to be honest.
Yeah, it was just the 100 years, but They packed a lot of stuff into that 100 years, I can tell you that.
Okay.
Yeah, also that time period, to give you an idea of what else is happening in the world, Spain is conquering South America, and Martin Luther is nailing his 95 Thesis to a church in Germany, to give you an idea of kind of where we are historically in the West. Early colonial imperialism is starting to take its modern shape, and the Protestant Reformation is starting to become a big thing. One of these clans, one of these families that's fighting in the Sengoku Jidai, it was this small, unimportant clan from a backwater region on the east coast of the main island called Mikawa. That's the name of this province. It's in the modern-day Aichi prefecture. This clan were called the Matsudaira, and they were led by a daimyo named Matsudaira Hirotada. Now, as we're getting into this, there are a lot of names that are going to be like this. I'll do my best to keep track of them for you and help you out to remember who's who. It's just going to be one of those episodes. So this daimyo, Hirotada, he was a small fish in a big pond. He was surrounded by a lot of more powerful and very aggressive clans. Most importantly, the Imagawas to the east, who Hirotada was a vassal to, and the Odas to the west, who hated the Imagawas. He wasn't given a very good start either. His father committed ritual suicide when he was young. That's a shot.
Kampai.
Kampai. So, Hirotada's father committed ritual suicide when he was young. That ended up thrusting Hirotada into this awful Game of Thrones style politics of Japan at the ripe old age of 10. So, throughout his early reign, he was forced to contend not only with external warlord politics, but also with one of his uncles who was constantly trying to throw him off the throne. It was in this environment that Hirotada and his wife, who were aged 17 and 15 respectively, and were also step-siblings, they gave birth to a son at Okazaki Castle on January 31st, 1543. They named their son Matsudaira Takachiyo. Takachiyo would one day rule all of Japan under his better-known name, Tokugawa Ieyasu. When Ieyasu was 3, his mother's father, who was a vassal samurai under Hirotada, betrayed the Matsudaira clan and pledged allegiance to the Odas. In response, Hirotada divorced his wife, so Ieyasu's dad divorced his mom, and then sent her back to live with her family.
So, the warring period of Japan had a divorce system?
This divorce during this time for warlords like this usually consisted of either abandoning their wife and sending her back to her family, or just killing her.
Okay. So it was just like send them away or kill them.
Yeah, and Hirotada had a really, really strong sense of honor, like a lot more than a lot of these warlords had, which kind of sometimes worked against him. But he was fiercely loyal, and he did seem to have a genuine affection for his wife, but his honor couldn't handle being married to the wife of a traitor. So he divorced her and sent her away when Ieyasu was 3. And he would only meet his mother a couple times through the rest of his life. His father would end up remarrying and also had several concubines. So as Ieyasu got older, he would eventually have 11 half-brothers. 11 half-brothers and sisters. I think seven sisters and... 7 sisters, 4 brothers. Yeah. So when Ieyasu was 6, his father made a deal with the Imagawas, who they were vassals to, that the Imagawas would provide more manpower and resources in order to defend the Matsudaira lands in exchange for taking Ieyasu as a political hostage. So Ieyasu would be sent to Imagawa lands. He would be treated well. He would be raised to be a leader, eventually become the leader of the clan and give him a good education, take care of him, all that kind of stuff. But the threat of killing him if Hirotada ever got out of line would always be kind of there. That was the idea. But then something weird happened. So on his, before he could actually become a political hostage, on his way to Imagawa land, Ieyasu ended up being kidnapped by agents of the Oda clan. And so the enemy captured him and locked him in a Shinto temple for 3 years, trying to use him as like a political bargaining chip to try to force the Matsudaira to betray the Imagawas and join the Odas. And so Ieyasu ended up spending 3 years of his life just locked up in a temple, from when he was 6 until he was like 9.
That's weird. The whole political prisoner stuff always like baffles me in the historical context, where like it's like a high level political figure, because they keep them for years but they don't kill them, is what confuses me. Like, I wouldn't think you would keep someone alive that long, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, the idea of keeping them prisoners is that you don't intend to kill them. You just are willing to kill them in case the parents of or the relatives of the person you're keeping hostage decide to do something, like decide to try to betray them. You've got a little bit of leverage over them. It's just another thing that they have to factor into their calculations of like whose side should I be joining? Well, this side might be offering me a good deal, but the other side that I'm with currently has my relative. So that's the kind of the idea behind it. It's always kind of understood that like they're probably not going to kill them as long as I keep doing what I'm doing. They're going to be fine. But if I decide to do something wonky, then that's when their life starts getting put in jeopardy. So that's the whole idea behind it. It does not make sense on a human level, but it makes perfect sense in just a raw political level. Morally, it's absolutely reprehensible, and any system that allows this to happen deserves to be thrust into the dustbin of history. But
there's a whole lot of stuff that happens even today that is morally reprehensible that we just have to deal with as a fact of life.
Yeah. So he's locked up in this temple for 3 years. While he's locked up, his dad dies of... there's two stories to how he died. So his dad dies. One story is that he died of tuberculosis. The other was that he was betrayed by some of his samurai who were bribed by the Oda. Either way, he was either 22 or 24 when he died. So he's out of the picture now. So now Ieyasu's father is dead. Interestingly enough, to make this situation even weirder and more complicated, around the same time, the daimyo of the Oda clan, who was keeping him prisoner, also died of some sort of disease. And when he died, he left the clan to his heir, who is, like I mentioned before, the second most important person in this story, Oda Nobunaga. And so this is how Nobunaga is entering our story. He is rising to power, and one of his main political bargaining chips that he has coming to power is that he has the son of the Matsudaira clan, who is our main character. So while Ieyasu is prisoner, Nobunaga's brother ended up ended up being besieged in a castle. It was being besieged by the Imagawa. They were back at war again, and the Imagawa were threatening to break through and raid the castle. And if that happened, Nobunaga's brother probably would have died. And so Nobunaga agreed that in exchange for lifting the siege and not assaulting the castle, they would release Ieyasu. And so they agreed, and Ieyasu was freed around age of 9 or 10. But now that he was free, he wasn't really free, because when he got back home to Mikawa, he found out that the Imagawa still really wanted to enforce that deal they had made with his father. So he arrived long enough to go visit his father's grave, and then he was immediately put on a horse and shipped off to Imagawa land to become a prisoner again.
Lovely.
And so this is where he'd spend a lot of like his formative years, is with the Imagawa under his captor, but also a guy who ended up becoming like his sort of adopted father. And that was the daimyo of the Imagawa, a guy named Imagawa Yoshimoto. And this situation, it was better off than when he was locked up in that temple. He had a nice house all to himself. He had servants. He had an education that was befitting his title. As he entered his preteen years, he got really into falconry.
They let him do falconry while a prisoner of war, essentially?
Falconry was one of those things that, like, it was considered like an aspect of like military training. It was kind of the same thing in Europe too. Like, so around 13, that would have been like an appropriate age or they would have considered.
They gave him military training?
Oh yeah, he was going to be a daimyo. A daimyo is a military position.
Yeah, but he's a prisoner of war. Why not make him weak? Make him not know anything so you can take advantage of him later.
Because they want him to be because he's still going to be, when he's leading his clan, he's still going to be a military leader. So they want him to be an effective soldier because he'll be fighting on their behalf. So, but yeah, he got really into falconry. I don't think Japan really has falcons, but they do have hawks. So he was using he had like a bunch of pet hawks that he loved them to death. He spent all of his free time with them. He wasn't a very good student. He didn't like doing book work or reading or reciting philosophy or poetry or anything like that. He really, really preferred spending time with his hawks and swimming. Those were his two big passions. But despite that, all of the adults in his life agreed that he was really shaping up to be a bit of a natural leader. He was very charismatic. He was really good at making friends. He was also apparently beginning to show signs of being both cruel and ruthless. He was often very abusive to his servants, even as like a preteen. And it's a good indicator of kind of where his life is going. He's a really good talker and he's a really good leader, but he's also capable of vindictive violence. So kind of keep that sort of profile in your head thinking when you're imagining this guy. So for Japanese nobility at the time, when a boy turns 14, it means that he's coming of age. That's kind of when you became an adult, as in the Japanese nobility and the upper echelons. There's a special ceremony that comes with that, where a boy is given a new name for maturity, standing in for his dead father. His adoptive father / captor, Imagawa Yoshimoto, grants him a new name, and he becomes Matsudaira Motonobu.
That's the first name change to 3 sips.
Yep. Also, because he's now of age, the Imagawas release him from his captivity, and they allow him to return home to rule his clan. So he's 14. The year is 1556. When he returned home, he quickly got married to a woman who's remembered in history by the name, everywhere I looked, referred to her as Lady Tsukiyama. From what I could tell back then, women didn't seem to really go by their family names at all. They just had one name. So his wife's name was Tsukiyama. And Tsukiyama happened to be the daughter of his adopted father, Imagawa Yoshimoto.
Oh, wow.
And you're never going to guess, he changes his name again.
I would have never guessed.
He's only gone by his new name for about a year, and he's already changing it again. And so Ieyasu took his third name, Matsudaira Motoyasu.
3 more sips, boy.
So soon after their marriage, they had a son. They named their son after him, his original name, Takachiyo. Later on, he would be more famously known by the name Matsudaira Nobuyasu. And he's going to come up one more time in this story, and it's really going to suck. So, when Ieyasu was 17, the year was 1558, he fought and commanded in his first battle. The events, the context around this, one of his samurai who was pledged to him defected to the Odas, and so he decided he wasn't going to have any of that and went to recapture the samurai's castle, the castle of Terabe. I don't know how to pronounce that in Japanese. Terabe, that sounds fine.
It sounds like a Japanese name.
So after putting the castle to siege, Oda Nobunaga found out and ended up sending a relief army to break the siege. But Ieyasu was prepared and actually managed to defeat this reinforcing army, and in the process took the castle as well. So this is his first battle that he's ever seen. His first time ever on a battlefield. He's commanding troops as the overall general, and he beats the armies of Oda Nobunaga, which is a really impressive feat. Yeah, that's a. You want to go and sit for that for the battle? Yeah.
The battle. Yeah.
The following year, when he was 18, he was once again proving himself to be a pretty effective commander. He was able to bring supplies to a besieged Imagawa castle. He accomplished that by sending parts of his forces to attack 2 other forts. And so those 2 forts that were being attacked, there were 2 more forts that the Odas had that sent out all of the garrisons in those 2 forts, went to try and relieve the 2 forts that were being besieged. And so those other 2 forts were empty, and so he was able to pass his army through there without having to worry about being attacked. And so he was able to break through the Oda lines and go and relieve this other fort that was being besieged. And so that was his second great victory.
I mean, it sounds like he's got a great training, even though he's a prisoner of war.
Yeah, he's Imagawa Yoshimoto was another one of those like really famous names during this period. He was a pretty successful general and commander in his own right, and so he had some pretty good teachers, but he also had just this natural skill, this natural instinct that even at such a young age, he knew exactly what to do when. Just one of those guys that you put him in a position, you put him at the head of an army, and he can move mountains. It's one of those once in a generation types of guys.
Yeah, definitely.
Before he was even 20, Ieyasu was already shaping up to be one of the Imagawa's best commanders. And then some crazy shit happened. In 1560, Imagawa Yoshimoto launched an enormous invasion of Oda territory with 25,000 men, but ended up being ambushed by Oda Nobunaga's forces at the Battle of Okayazama, and Yoshimoto ended up being killed. In the aftermath, the Imagawa clan was thrown into chaos, and his death completely turned the tides of this war. For Oda Nobunaga, this would be the victory that would establish him as one of the leading military powers in Japan, because for the Odas, the Imagawas were the main sort of group kind of standing in the way of regional dominance in central Japan. and they kind of been locked in a bit of a stalemate for a little while, for a couple generations by that point. But Nobunaga was a really, really, really good general. He was a brilliant tactician and was able.
I mean, he comes up even when you're not trying to find out about him, to be perfectly honest. Speaking from someone who, like, Oda Nobunaga is someone you can hear about referenced just in a random anime, and you'd be like, oh my god. It's like, that's a historical figure. You would never guess at how significant of a, like, role he plays.
Yeah. Just to give you an idea of where we're going, I think I told you there were 3 great unifiers of Japan.
I don't remember if you mentioned it in the podcast, but I did not know before that there were 3 great unifiers.
Yeah. So the first one, and the most famous one, was Oda Nobunaga. The third one and the most successful one is going to be Ieyasu.
Oh, wow. So this is going to be like all within the Warring States period. Great.
Yes, this is going to be within the next 30 or 40 years.
Jesus Christ.
So, yeah. So with the Imagawas now pretty much collapsing, their entire clan is just falling apart now with because they're great. Really, he was a very effective, like in any other era of Japanese history, he'd be one of the greatest military minds of his generation. Was this guy Yoshimoto. But just by the fact that he happened to live at the same time as Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu, he ended up.
I wonder, like, slight derailment, I wonder how many more people that were like, that are the, like, famous but not really famous names in history that were like a footnote underneath a even more successful person would be more successful outside of their era if they didn't have to face that, like, ungodly monster that they did in skill.
Yeah. I always think of that Italian guy who the movie Mozart was about him.
I've never seen that movie.
There was this Italian composer who was one of the most brilliant. He wrote some of the most beautiful songs of his generation, and he was this brilliant, amazing, like genuinely gifted musician. But he happened to be working at the same time as Mozart. And so Mozart completely overshadowed him, and barely anybody remembers. I can't even remember his name now.
Mozart absolutely trashed him just because he was that much better.
Yeah, just because he happened to be Mozart. Just sheer dumb luck.
And you can't compete with Mozart. That's the issue. Like, there are certain people that are just like a once-in-a-lifetime genius.
I remember his name. It was Salieri.
I think I've heard of him. I'm not a great, like, member of that, but Salieri does sound familiar.
Yeah, Salieri is one of the greatest classical composers who ever lived, and the only reason he isn't considered one of the greats like Bach or Beethoven is because he happened to be working at the exact same time as Mozart.
And it's insane to think, like, just imagine how they would feel at the time. Then they have to find out, oh, I was against person that's going to be known generations and generations later. I just imagine what that would do for their confidence to know they were like that person who rivaled them, even though they didn't get like the famous composers like Mozart, Beethoven, and all that. Could you imagine what that would do for your confidence if you find out, oh, I don't suck. I'm like right up there with this guy who's going to be known in history, even if my name doesn't get recorded in history.
Yeah. But the thing was that it did cost him a lot of like money and prestige when he was alive, because like the courts of Europe weren't going out looking for Salieri. They were going out looking for Mozart. They wanted Mozart to perform in their opera halls, not Salieri. And even though
it sucks, it does, but like, I guess hindsight is 20/20.
Anyways, this is not a Salieri podcast. This is an Ieyasu podcast. So yeah, this battle, the Battle of Okayazama, is one of those battles that in hindsight ended up becoming like one of the most formative events in the history of a nation. Because this was the battle that put Oda Nobunaga down the road of becoming one of the great unifiers of the nation. And by extension, because Nobunaga was led down this path, Ieyasu would end up following behind him. After the battle, Ieyasu ended up sitting down and having a little chat with all of his samurai and all of his counselors, everybody who governed with him. Here, he demonstrated that even though he had all of the talent of his father, even though he died at like 24, was shaping up to be a very, very prominent, very effective general. And if he had survived, probably would have been one of those famous names of the period. And Ieyasu was really showing that he had a lot of those same talents, but he wasn't as much a stickler about all of those old ideas of like honor and loyalty that his father had been. His counselors pointed out, accurately, I might say, that the new Imagawa daimyo, Imagawa Ojizane, wasn't exactly up to the task of leading a war effort. This guy was a little more interested in like music and painting and those kinds of things than he was in like warfare, which might have served him well in different times, but this was the warring states period, so not gonna do very well.
I imagine not.
They also pointed out that the Imagawa's war was destroying the Matsudaira clan. They were being bled dry by their Imagawa masters, who were taking most of their grain as taxes and sending all of their troops on all of the most dangerous missions. And so the Matsudairas always ended up having like the most disproportionately high casualties compared to the Imagawa armies, because they were always at the front. They were always the ones doing the most fighting and all of the heavy lifting. On the other hand, if they switched sides and joined the Oda Nobunaga was kicking around the idea of marching his army north to Kyoto. Now that he had a pretty good stronghold in central Japan, it was a real possibility he could march on the capital and might even take control of the shogunate for himself.
Interesting.
The only thing that was stopping him was a concern over the possibility of being invaded from behind while his army was gone. A fear which would be alleviated if he had a strong ally on that side, like the Matsudaira. And so Ieyasu was presented with the choice of either remaining loyal to a dying clan and being dragged down with them, or hitching his wagon to the rising star that was Oda Nobunaga, with the potential of being early friends of a man who might soon be the most powerful man in the country.
I mean, it sounds like a smart move, I'm not gonna lie. Knowing how Nobunaga turns out in history, it sounds like the smartest move he could have made.
Yeah, it sounds like an easy choice.
I'm sure it wasn't at the time.
For Ieyasu, it was 100% an easy choice. I bet he didn't think twice about it.
Oh, did he not?
No, he was completely ruthless and he had no scruples at all. Loyalty was a tool. And it's a tool he was willing to put down if it wasn't useful to him at that moment.
Wow.
That's something that you need to understand about this guy is when he was dealing with politics and dealing with military strategy, nothing was off the table, which didn't make him unique, but the way that he was able to put aside a sense of duty or a sense of morality, which was so ubiquitous within the culture that he was brought up in, is bordering on kind of sociopathic how easy it was for him.
I'm like, to be honest, again, we don't have the ability to like tell anymore, but the amount of people throughout history that most likely fit the diagnostic standards of sociopath would be ridiculous, at least historical figure wise.
Now, to be clear, I do not think that Ieyasu was a sociopath, because he did have a lot of relationships, and if he did have a friend or a loved one that he was genuinely very close to and very loyal to, he did always go out of his way, even to the point of self-sacrifice, to provide for them.
Sounds like a great man, to be honest.
Yeah, but he was also willing to kill the people he loved to preserve his political power because it served a greater purpose.
I spoke too soon.
Yeah, we will get it. Oh man, are we going to get into that when we get to that point? So, in 1561, the Matsudaira publicly broke with the Imagawa and captured and they went and captured the Imagawa fortress of Kaminogo. In capturing this fortress, he had the help. I'm 90% sure you'd have at least heard this name before. To capture this fortress, he had the help of one of his closest advisors and retainers. Was this guy named Hattori Hanzo.
I actually haven't heard that name before.
You haven't. This guy is the stereotype. He is the living embodiment of everything that people associate with ninjas.
Interesting. I've heard the name Hanzo, but I've never heard his name before because
there are so many characters in like popular culture and all different kinds of fiction that are named after him, specifically because he's often been considered like one of the greatest, if not the greatest swordsman in all of Japanese history.
Wow.
And he is also like an insanely good ninja. One of the most successful ninjas that ever lived. And he became famous and got his rise to prominence by being so close to and so loyal to Ieyasu. He would save Ieyasu's life on multiple occasions in different battles or different assassination attempts, things like that, several times. And I want to read more on him because he sounds like such a cool fucking guy. And from reading about him, this is something else that I've kind of picked up from the little bit of Japanese history that I've read about. Ninjas are always kind of associated with like lying and dishonesty and subterfuge and stuff like that, which they were good at. But it's always kind of associated with like negative traits like disloyalty and backstabbing and things like that. And then samurai are always kind of associated with like Bushido, like a code of honor and a code of conduct, and being very, very stoic and loyal to death to your landlord, yeah, like your lord and that kind of thing. And then you look at history, and you look at all of these daimyos and all of these samurais during the Warring States period. All of them are stabbing each other in the back constantly. You've got political assassinations. You've got familial murder. You've got all of that kind of stuff going on with the samurais. And then you look at the ninjas like Hattori Hanzo. He was a really neat guy. He seemed like a genuinely good person.
Don't you love how like history paints people completely different how they probably should be?
Yeah, and you look at a lot of other stories about ninjas, and it seems pretty uniform. Like, ninjas were loyal to a fault.
Oh, yeah.
Whoever they were serving, like, they would die without question for them. And they served till death. It was everything that people think about ninjas and samurai should be completely reversed. It's funny. But, yeah, Hattori Hanzo, just keep in mind, he's not going to come up much anymore from this point forward, but keep in mind pretty much everything that's happening in the story, Hattori Hanzo is right there beside Ieyasu, and probably saving his life from some assassination attempt or another. So, to seal this new alliance with the Oda, Ieyasu betrothed his son.
Oh, I had realized I hadn't poured a shot to get ready, so I was doing that, and I had just stuck it back in my ice because I wanted to make sure my whiskey is cold because I'm a wimp.
So Ieyasu betrothed his son to Nobunaga's daughter, and that's how they sealed their alliance. And so with this changing of allegiance, Ieyasu decided he was going to once again change his name. He finally adopted the name that I've been using this whole time, Ieyasu. But he was still going by his clan name at the time, Matsudaira. So he was Matsudaira Ieyasu.
3 sips.
Ieyasu spent the next few years consolidating control over Mikawa province, stamping out traitorous vassals, and specifically dealing with this weird radical movement that had grown up in his lands. So let's take a moment and talk about the Ikko Ikki. Have you ever heard that term before, the Ikko Ikki?
Absolutely not.
The Ikko Ikki were Shin Buddhists, which is a branch of Buddhism that believes that a person does not require rebirth in order to achieve nirvana, but that a person can reach nirvana within their current life. So the Ikko themselves were the followers of this charismatic preacher, this monk named Renyo. And Renyo preached that, based on this Shin Buddhist teaching, he preached that the daimyo warlords and the violence of the Warring States period was driving people away from the path of enlightenment. And so he advocated for a social revolution that would dismantle the system of the daimyos and create a society of peace, which could foster every individual's path to enlightenment. And so over the course of the Onin War and the Sengoku period, the Ikko had formed these sort of pseudo-anarchistic, they were kind of like anarchist communes, these autonomous communities that were based around Buddhist monasteries. And it was really cool. Like these imagine like an anarchist commune that was defended by Buddhist warrior monks.
That sounds dope.
It was dope as shit. These guys are so cool. And the Ikko would recruit followers from all walks of life. Everyone from peasants to merchants to small landowners, even a few samurai, and like a daimyo or two joined the Ikko out of a sense of like religious responsibility. This movement probably would have remained pretty small and insignificant if it weren't for the fact that the Ikko were the very first group of people in all of Japan to adopt the widespread use of firearms. The first firearms had been introduced into Japan by Portuguese merchants in the 1540s. And so the Ikko, with their cannons and matchlock muskets, they had been able to carve out autonomous zones for themselves all over Japan, especially in the north. And they were a prominent threat to the stability of many of the daimyos throughout Japan. The province of Mikawa, as it turns out, was one of the hotbeds of the Ikko Ikki in central Japan. And Ieyasu would have to uproot them in order to ensure the unity of his province. He waged several campaigns, finally culminating in the Battle of Azukazaka. Yeah, Azukazaka in 1564. And then by the end of 1565, the Ikko were no longer a threat in Mikawa. So, yeah, that's it for them now.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that's such a crazy fucking story.
I mean, to be fair, I always knew the Sengoku Jidai was freaking crazy to begin with. Like, it's the Sengoku Jidai is like a crazy period in history for every sense of the word.
Yeah. So Ieyasu, he successfully unified and pacified all of the province of Mikawa. And with this final unification, he decided that he was going to change his name one last time. This time he was going to change the name of his whole clan.
This is the actual last one?
This is the actual last one, yes.
I felt like there would be more.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was a lot, though.
To be fair, yeah. Like, that many name changes was kind of ridiculous. But, hey-ho.
So, no longer would he be a Matsudaira, but instead the head of the Tokugawa clan. Now, before you ask, I looked for a meaning behind this name. As far as I could tell, it has some sort of basis in this legend, like this family legend, that they are descended from a legendary Japanese emperor from the 9th century named Emperor Seiwa. But I have absolutely no idea what the linguistic connection is. I have no idea how they got Tokugawa from Seiwa, or what where that would have come from. Anyways, though, now he is officially Tokugawa Ieyasu, and that is what he will be for the rest of his life.
3 sips.
Let's pivot back real quick to this other guy, Oda Nobunaga. Since 1561, Nobunaga had been making alliances both with other powerful clans, including another clan called the Takeda, and also with disaffected members of the Shogun's family, the Ashikaga, including another claimant to leadership of the Ashikaga, this guy named Ashikaga Yoshiaka. In 1568, Nobunaga was finally able to press his strong position and successfully defeated the sitting shogun in these sorts of political movers, and was able to peacefully march his army into the city of Kyoto on November 9th, 1568, and installed this other shogun pretender as his puppet. The newly minted Tokugawa clan under Ieyasu, being the Oda's allies and vassals, were with the army when they entered the city. So as we stand, Tokugawa Ieyasu is one of the most powerful allies of the most powerful man in all of Japan. Over the coming years, Ieyasu would be indispensable for Nobunaga's wars. In 1570, he helped Oda put down a rebellious vassal at the Battle of Anagawa. That's another sip. And that battle was actually famous because it was the first time in Japanese history outside of the Ikko that any official standing army, not like a rebel army, but like an official army of the government of Japan, made widespread use of muskets, because Oda Nobunaga was starting to adopt muskets into his army a lot more. Muskets and cannons, just firearms generally. Yes. The following year, in 1571, Oda's former ally, the Takeda clan, who was led by another famous name from this period, Takeda Shingen, which that name sounds really familiar to me for some reason. But
Takeda, yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, I've heard of the Takedas before because I played Total War Shogun 2. That was one of my favorite games in high school. So I knew all of the names of these clans going into this, but I've heard the name Shingen before. I'm not sure where, but the Takeda broke off their alliance with the Oda and allied with a clan that was hostile to the Oda called the Hojo. This alliance was brokered from under Nobunaga's nose by the new shogun that he put in power, because this new shogun hoped that if the Takeda and the Hojo could drive the Oda out of Kyoto, that he could expand his own autonomy and kind of restore his own order to Japan on his own. And so the Takeda went to war with the Oda and began this new conflict with an invasion of the Tokugawa lands. So Ieyasu's lands are now being invaded by these guys. So within a year of fighting, Shingen had captured a couple Tokugawa castles, and they were on their way to besiege the capital of Mikowa, or of the Tokugawas, at Hamamatsu Castle. In a last-ditch effort to push back the Takeda, Ieyasu met the enemy army at the Battle of Mikatagahara. Yeah. And so he met the Takeda army at the Battle of Mikatagahara, reinforced by 3,000 Oda troops, but he was still seriously outnumbered despite these reinforcements, and Shingen was a pretty good commander in his own right. So the Tokugawa forces ended up being crushed. This is Ieyasu's first real defeat, and it was bad. It was really bad. They were completely a couple thousand guys died. They were scattered to the winds. He was able to successfully sort of reorganize his troops to create like an organized retreat, and to try and keep his troops calm so he could better control them, made their retreat as calm and organized as possible. And when they got back to the castle, he ordered the garrison there to welcome the army in as like conquering heroes. They were doing stuff like lighting bonfires and banging on drums. And when they came in as sort of like a symbolic, like don't worry, you're safe here, they left the gates open.
Of course they did.
Yeah. So usually this would end badly. It's usually a bad idea to leave the gates of a fortress open when there's an enemy army nearby.
How does it not end badly?
When the Takeda showed up, they saw all of the lights from the bonfires, and they saw all the noise that they were making. It sounded like a party inside, and the gates were wide open. They thought this was a trap, and so they refused to besiege the castle.
Wow. So they tricked themselves into thinking it was a trap, essentially.
Yeah, and as far as I could tell from reading, Ieyasu, this was not intentional. It was a mistake. He didn't mean to leave the gates open. They just ended up being left open.
Wow, talk about lucky.
And so they decided not to besiege the castle, and Shingen ordered that instead that they pitch camp a little ways away from the castle. That turned out to be a huge mistake on their part, because Ieyasu realized they were out there, and once night fell and the Takeda were asleep, Ieyasu led his army out under the cover of darkness and ambushed the Takeda army while they slept. The Takeda were so broken and disoriented that Shingen was unable to reorganize his army, and he had to call off the entire offensive. And they were forced to retreat back into Takeda land. Later that year, Shingen ended up dying in another battle somewhere. And his son, Takeda Katsuyori, ended up taking over the clan. And he, being a young upstart little shit, tried to launch another invasion of Tokugawa lands in 1574.
Of course he did.
Yeah. At the siege, this is only like a year later. At the siege of Nagashino, Castle, his forces were attacked by the combined armies of Tokugawa Ieyasu and Oda Nobunaga with about 38,000 men, and ended up driving the Takeda out of the province.
That's insane.
Yeah. This was the first time that Ieyasu and Nobunaga would fight together.
But was it the last time?
No, they had a lot more fighting to go.
I figure.
They launched a counteroffensive, and for the next 7 years, they fought a succession.
7 years?
This next campaign lasted 7 years. They ended up fighting a succession of small battles until they finally defeated the Takeda army in 1582 at the Battle of Tenmokuzen, I guess. I guess that's another sip, isn't it? The Takeda daimyo was captured, and he was forced to commit seppuku. And with his death, the war came to an end, and the Takeda clan ceased to exist. A shot?
Yeah, he committed seppuku.
Kanpai. So we've gotten to 1582, the Battle of Tenmokuzen. The Takeda are dead, but let's rewind a little bit because I needed to bring this up. This is where we get to some more weird shit and some of the darker parts of Ieyasu's like personality. And like
It's Japan. It's always weird shit.
that's fair, yes. To understand what I'm about to describe, you got to kind of know a little bit about Oda Nobunaga's personality. You got to know this to kind of really get the full weight of what what I'm about to describe.
I mean, the picture I have, and I know it's like it's more of a caricature, is he's a battle-hungry, land-grabbing warlord.
Now, you just described every person with any amount of political power during this period. So, technically, that is not inaccurate.
I'm just saying how he's been portrayed to me.
Yes, that is not an inaccurate way, but I don't think it paints the full picture. Nobunaga was a tyrant in every
Oh yeah, for certain.
in every sense of the word, politically, militarily, and personally, in every single way. Reading about him, he sounds like he was a supremely unpleasant person to be around. He was ruthless, he was vindictive, he was autocratic, he was very controlling. And as is common for people with his type of personality, he was very deeply paranoid. In 1579, in the middle of the campaign against the Takeda, Nobunaga got it into his head that Ieyasu's wife, Tsukiyama, and Ieyasu's oldest son and heir, Nobuyasu, that those two were plotting to murder him.
Lovely.
He came to this conclusion because, as it happens, Ieyasu's son Nobuyasu, who's being accused of an assassination plot, Nobuyasu was actually married to the daughter of the daimyo of the Takeda clan, who they were fighting. And so because of that connection, Nobunaga got it into his mind that Ieyasu's son was trying to murder him. And so he threatened to break off their alliance if Ieyasu didn't bring the two of them, his son and his wife, to justice.
Jesus Christ.
In an absolutely stunning display of callous politics, Ieyasu ordered his wife to be executed and his son to commit seppuku. Two orders which were dutifully carried out. Can you believe that?
I can see people doing it. Do I see myself ever being capable of doing such a task? Fuck no.
No, absolutely not. No. That's some more seppuku.
Kampai.
Goodbye. So with these orders carried out, the alliance was safe and stronger than ever. Like, this confirmed in Nobunaga's mind that Ieyasu was his guy. He was the most trustworthy of all of his vassals. Ieyasu named a new heir, it would be his third son, Tokugawa Hideyoshi. All this being said, in 1582, after this campaign against the Takeda are over, Nobunaga was pretty much the undisputed ruler of central Japan. He was probably well on his way to completely dominating the entire country. He was sending armies out on several major offensives against other powerful daimyos. Unfortunately for him, we'll never know if he would be able to do that because things fell apart very, very quickly. Shortly after the defeat of the Takeda, Nobunaga was touring the Kansai region and stopped off at a temple called the Honnoji Temple. He stopped off there just to look over some maps, write some letters, coordinate some of the offensives that he was starting against some of the other powerful regional daimyos. While he was there, one of his generals, a guy named Akechi Mitsuhide, turned against him and betrayed him and ended up attacking the temple with his army of 13,000. Including himself, Nobunaga had about 80 men to defend against this attack. They fought very briefly before Nobunaga and his son and heir, Oda Nobunaga, both committed seppuku.
I'm only counting that as one, by the way.
That's fine. That is perfectly okay. After their deaths, after they committed seppuku, on his orders, his servants burnt the temple to the ground so that they wouldn't be able to capture his body. Kanpai?
Kampai.
When Ieyasu heard about Nobunaga's death, he rushed back home to gather his army and prepare for war against the usurper general. But 2 weeks later, as he was organizing his forces, he received word that general, Akechi Mitsuhide, had been beaten and killed at the Battle of Yamazaki by Nobunaga's other most powerful ally. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the second of the three great unifiers of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Is that another name you've never heard before?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, let's talk about Toyotomi Hideyoshi for a moment, because it seems like he's coming out of nowhere, isn't it?
It does, exactly.
Yeah. Hideyoshi began his life as a peasant. He was born in the year 1538 to an ashigaru. An ashigaru is a peasant who would enter into the service of his local samurai lord as a foot soldier. The majority of the soldiers in the armies of this time were ashigaru. As a young man, Hideyoshi became an honest-to-God, like RPG Skyrim sort of adventurer. He just traveled around Japan doing whatever the hell he wanted, exploring castles and meeting monks and shrines and meeting daimyos and academics and famous swordsmen and things like that. Like he was an adventurer, like from like Lord of the Rings shit. It's really cool. So he was just traveling around the countryside, making a living by offering his services as an ashigaru to the various lords. He spent a little bit of time actually under the service of Imagawa Yoshimoto, the guy who raised Ieyasu. And then in 1558, he entered the service of Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga had noticed this guy's skill as a warrior, and then after defeating the Imagawas in 1560, he made Hideyoshi a samurai. He gave him a little plot of land, made him a samurai.
Wait, did the title samurai come with plots of land? I didn't know that part.
Oh yeah, the samurai were like minor nobility.
I didn't know that. Was it similar with knights or not? Did knights get land?
Yeah, knights got land. They get like a castle. That's another common thing between knights and samurai, is that when the title of either a knight or a samurai also came with basically like you got a castle and whatever land was right around the castle.
I didn't know that about it either. That's interesting.
Yeah, so most of these castles that I've been talking about in all these battles were owned by some knight or another.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then that castle would have like its own batch of peasants that would work the land around the castle as like farmland, and then they'd give a portion of those crops to the samurai as a tax, and then the samurai would be able to use that produce however it is that he wanted, the profit from that produce however he wanted. That was one of the benefits of being a samurai. And so Hideyoshi, he was made a samurai and was made one of Oda Nobunaga's retainers. He would remain one of Nobunaga's most trusted advisors through these decades, rising all the way through the ranks until eventually he was made a general, putting him in a position to be able to take over the remnants of the Oda clan after Nobunaga's death. In 1583, Ieyasu took advantage of the geopolitical chaos that was caused by Nobunaga's death, and he launched a campaign against the Hojo clan. So he's kind of like in a position of like, well, there goes my
Benefactor?
there goes my benefactor, my sort of ticket to prominence in the country. I gotta kind of forge my own way at this point. So he invades the Hojo, and as that was happening, Nobunaga's vassals fought for control over his lands, and Ieyasu was going to sit all of this out. He didn't want to be a part of this shit. It would just weaken him. He was going after the weak target while he let all the other people fight amongst themselves. So of all of these different vassals fighting amongst one another, Toyotomi Hideyoshi eventually came out on top after defeating another daimyo named Shibata Katsuie at the Battle of Shitsugatake. And like I said, Ieyasu prudently decided to sit that war out and deal with whoever came out as the victor, who happened to be Hideyoshi. The following year, in 1584, Ieyasu made the interesting and dangerous choice of picking a fight with Hideyoshi. Because by this point, now that he'd taken over like what used to be the Oda, Hideyoshi had more or less become the new most powerful daimyo in Japan.
I mean, it sounds like the perfect explanation, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, but Ieyasu was still kind of a small fish at this point. He was powerful, but he wasn't that powerful. Ieyasu supported the claim of the closest heir of the Oda clan, even though the Oda pretty much were scattered by this point. The clan essentially didn't exist anymore. But Nobunaga still had a younger son who still claimed the throne. And so Ieyasu invaded Toyotomi lands, but after a year-long campaign, neither army was really able to gain the upper hand, because as it turns out, Hideyoshi and Ieyasu are both really good generals, and apparently ended up being pretty evenly matched in this situation. And so they were they couldn't solve it through fighting. They were forced to solve it through negotiations. They agreed to end the war, and as part of the deal, Hideyoshi ended up adopting Ieyasu's second oldest son, who was named Ogimaru.
Interesting.
Yeah, so you're seeing all of these connections being like, Ieyasu had one son who was an in-law of Oda Nobunaga. Now he has one son who's an in-law of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. It's just happening all over the place. This is how politics worked at the time. Is a marriage wasn't an alliance. That's just how it worked. So for the next few years, Ieyasu kind of sat on the sidelines, consolidating his power in his newly acquired lands, and watching on as Hideyoshi launched several successful wars of unification. This Hideyoshi becomes... So this is kind of how it works. Oda Nobunaga was the first unifier.
Okay.
He was the guy who broke the eternal stalemate of the Warring States period. He's the guy who finally was able to consolidate enough power to change the balance of politics within the country and create like a functioning faction that would be able to take over politics. And then he died. And then Toyotomi Hideyoshi took over. Hideyoshi would be the guy who brought all of the disparate lands of Japan back under the fold of a single central authority. That would be his great legacy. And this is what he's doing at this moment, these wars of unification. He conquered pretty much all of southern Japan by the end of the 1580s. And by 1590, there was really only one daimyo left in Japan who still remained independent from Hideyoshi's sphere of influence.
Which was
Hojo Ujimasa, who was the leader of the Hojo clan. He was kind of based out of like northeastern Japan, like most of the northern part of Japan. When Ujimasa refused to submit to Hideyoshi, he launched one last campaign to unify the country. Ieyasu realized where the winds were blowing and knew full well that if he wanted a part to play in this new Japan that was being built, he'd have to dive in head first. And so he committed his entire army of 30,000 to this campaign, bringing the total force under Hideyoshi's command to 190,000.
Holy crap.
This was one of the largest armies that had ever been seen before in all of Japanese history by that point. This was an unprecedentedly large army. Within a year, they had completely wiped out and destroyed the Hojo. Literally, this clan ceased to exist. After the fall of Odawara Castle, the leadership of the Hojo clan admitted defeat, and all of them committed seppuku.
Is that another shot?
That is another shot.
I thought the last one was going to be the last shot. Fuck you, Derek.
I'm sorry.
Kampai.
Kanpai. With the complete elimination of the Hojo clan, Japan was finally completely reunified after 100 years of civil war. 100 years of civil war, and the Warring States period, the Sengoku Jidai, was finally over. This is the end.
So our guy actually ended the Sengoku Jidai.
Not our main guy, but Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He's the guy who ended it.
Okay.
Ieyasu is just a minor part of it. A prominent part of it, but still a minor part. As this campaign wound down, Hideyoshi actually approached Ieyasu and offered him this really, really interesting proposal. So here's how this offer worked, because Hideyoshi recognized that Ieyasu was probably the second most capable man in Japan at this point, and really wanted him in a strong position that would still keep him loyal. So Hideyoshi went to Ieyasu and made this proposal. Ieyasu would hand over all of the land that he currently owned and give it to Hideyoshi. And in exchange, he could have all of the land that had just been conquered from the Hojo. Does that make sense?
How did that turn out?
So Ieyasu ended up accepting, and he became the daimyo of the 8 provinces of the Kento region. This seemed like a weird choice, but it ended up being a brilliant bit of geopolitical maneuvering. So the Kanto region was close enough to Kyoto to remain relevant to national politics, but it was geographically isolated enough that he was able to maintain a certain amount of autonomy from the Toyotomi regime. His home region of Mikawa was small and poor, and it was smack in the middle of every warlord army crisscrossing the island, meaning that it was severely disadvantaged for building any political or economic power. But his new home in Kento, on the other hand, it was really rich, and it became even richer under Ieyasu's rule because of all of his investments in the local economy and infrastructure. And within a few years, he had firmly cemented himself as the second most powerful daimyo in Japan, just behind Hideyoshi himself.
Wow.
So this ended up being one of the greatest moves of his entire life. One of the most the best choices he ever made.
Sounds like it, to be perfectly honest.
Have you ever heard of the Kanto region?
I've heard of the fictionalized and Pokemon version of Kanto region, but I also know it's based on a real life place.
Yes, it is based on a real place. So in Kento, Ieyasu found himself a little fishing village on the coast that was strategically positioned to be really well defended. So it could be really well defended militarily, but it was still centrally located, so it could serve as a really good trade hub too. He had a castle built there and began building the town up around the castle into like a really respectable economic hub. It was a center of both highway trade and naval trade, or maritime trade. Eventually, he would make this blossoming city into the capital of his lands. This village was called Edo. Edo, Edo.
I know how it's spelled. I'm aware of the Edo period.
We'll get to that, yeah. Today, that little fishing village is now the largest city in the world, both by size and by population, under its current name, Tokyo.
So Tokyo was originally called Edo, is what you're saying? Interesting.
And it was basically founded by Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Wow. I'm surprised we don't know his name, given that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you
Like, I feel like he would be better known even by a Western world, given that fact.
yeah. So, just a year after reunification, the new leader of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, this guy got it into his head. Okay, this is where shit okay, shit was weird before. Now shit's getting squirrely.
Oh, lovely.
So, Toyotomi Hideyoshi is a little drunk on power at this point.
Of course.
If can you imagine if the United States had been locked in like a violent civil war for 100 years, and then all of a sudden you are the guy who is responsible for its complete reunification, and now you possess like a superpower, like a powerful, comparatively like a superpower compared to what existed before. Can you imagine like being in that position?
I imagine anyone in that position would be drunk on power.
Hideyoshi got it into his head that his new nation needed to be an empire. So he got the brilliant idea to invade and conquer the Joseon Kingdom in Korea.
Oh, is this where all the Korean-Japan hate comes from? Or was this prior?
It's where it started, but most of that hate comes from World War II.
I just know there's like a big animosity between the two, and I didn't know a whole lot about it until like...
There is quite a bit of history there, but the majority of the hatred comes from the comfort women and the work camps and the ethnic cleansing.
From what I understand, Japan did some, even for the time, some heinous shit to Korea.
Yeah, the Empire of Japan were the Asian Nazis. Literally, they were the Asian Nazis. That's what they did. Comparative stuff that was comparable to the Holocaust in Korea and China.
I'm surprised that's not brought up in history more, to be perfectly honest.
Have you ever heard of Unit 731? It was a military medical experimentation facility set up by the Japanese Empire in Korea that used Korean test subjects. And they used these subjects to test the effects of different diseases and different chemicals in order to find like a good chemical or disease to use as like a bioweapon or a weapon of mass destruction. And it killed thousands of innocent of civilian Koreans.
Only thousands?
Like I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head. I'm drunk. But it was some really heinous shit. Like they had an entire and like hundreds of people that were part of an experiment to see what the effects of injecting the bubonic plague directly into people's veins, what would happen if they did that.
That's completely unhumane and some absolute bullshit.
It's some absolute bullshit, yes. But yeah, so it's stuff like that, and also like the comfort women is a big point too. Do you know? Have you heard that term before?
You've brought it up to me before, but we've never like discussed it in depth.
Yeah. So the comfort women were Korean sex slaves. It literally the Japanese army in Korea nationalized the prostitution industry and made it exclusively for the private use of the army.
That's disgusting.
And so they would just kidnap Korean women from their families and force them into prostitution serving Japanese soldiers.
Again, that's disgusting.
Literally tens of thousands of... Actually, I think it was like hundreds of thousands of women.
Forced prostitution is disgusting. If you want to sell your body and you're not being forced due to economic circumstances, go for it. But any other circumstance, I think it's disgusting. And I don't blame you if you do it because of your economic circumstances. I still think it's disgusting because we put you in that situation.
Yes. Support sex workers, shoot pimps in the head.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to say. I don't think there's many people that would disagree with. There's a lot of people that disagree with the first part, but they're assholes, so we don't care.
There's plenty of people we don't give a fuck about their opinion. We put out some controversial opinions in this podcast already.
Anyways, so yeah, Hideyoshi decided he wanted to conquer Korea. So he did indeed launch an invasion. And this invasion was actually part of a larger plan. Once they secured Korea, he was going to use that peninsula as a giant launching pad so that he could invade and conquer all of China. I want to ask you something, Tim. I want to ask you something. Does it sound like a good idea for a country coming out of a century of civil war to immediately turn around and try to go on a world conquest?
No.
No, you don't think that's a good idea?
I would say you need to give at least a 5 to 10 year buff to make sure you build your shit up, to make sure you're actually prepared. Because getting out of 100-year infighting, you're not gonna be ready for the outside world. You gotta build up your union. You gotta build up your like interworking system.
Yeah. So Hideyoshi started the Imjin War, which was this invasion of Korea. And actually, weirdly enough, it started off at the very beginning. It started off all right for the Japanese. They were doing all right. So a large reason why it was doing all right was because this is literally the largest army that Japan had ever fielded in the entire history of the country up to that point. They landed 300,000 soldiers. 300,000, which was the largest naval invasion in all of human history up to that point. And, by the way, would hold that position until 1944 when the Western Allies landed 350,000 soldiers at Normandy.
That's kind of crazy.
It's insane. That is insane. I will say this for Hideyoshi. He was an amazing fucking administrator. That takes an insane amount of logistics that most people would never even be able to dream of. And he carried it out. And it was moderately successful for a little bit.
It is insane. Agreed.
All right. So, yeah. Hideyoshi launches this 300,000 man strong invasion of Korea. They initially capture like a really big chunk of land and several strategically important fortresses. But then a combination of guerrilla warfare from Korean civilians and reinforcements from the Ming Dynasty in China eventually forced the Japanese out in 1596. They tried one more time the following year, but that attempt ultimately ended when Hideyoshi died in 1598.
How did he die?
Just illness.
Okay.
I can't remember exactly which one, but yeah, he was old. He was born in the 1530s, so he was like in the 70s by that point.
Which is honestly just pretty long life.
Yeah, considering the life he lived, like pretty impressive. But the Japanese armies ended up abandoning Korea forever, never tried to invade again, all the way up to the present day. Nothing bad ever happened, and oh my god, why is there so much blood?
I love your sarcasm, Derek.
But Ieyasu was smarter than all of that, and rightfully sat out the war, because, Ieyasu is a brilliant guy. The first failure in 1596, after 4 years of really rough fighting, severely hurt Toyotomi's legitimacy throughout the country. And so when Hideyoshi died, this is how he died. He was in a crazed babbling delirium from some sort of old age mental illness. That's how he died.
Sounds about right.
So when Hideyoshi died, his is kind of an Alexander the Great sort of situation. His successors ended up struggling to maintain the loyalty of his vassals.
I would argue it's almost impossible after your death to have your successor maintain your previous.
Yeah, because when you're in a situation like that, like Toyotomi or with Alexander, at the position that they were at, the stability of this empire they had built was completely dependent on their own personality, because the conquest was built around their personality. It was their will and their brain power that made it happen. And so the state kind of builds itself around that. And so when that will is gone, then the state doesn't really have anything to latch on to. And that's what makes that's something that I don't think I really elaborated on when we talked about Frederick the Great, was that he did something very similar. He kind of built a superpower out of nothing. And it was very much built on his own willpower, but he also had the foresight.
I would argue that while, yes, at the time it was a superpower, it's not the same kind of superpower we're talking about now.
It's not. No, it's very different circumstances, but I think a lot of the same principles sort of apply, because it was yeah.
You're not wrong. I was just making like a clarification on my part.
Yeah, it was a state that's power was like insanely expanded in reach and in influence, and it was all centered around the willpower and the personality of one single individual. But what made it different from Hideyoshi or from Alexander was Frederick's state was built to last. He was just as good an administrator as he was a general. So he could expand, but he could also secure those expansions. And so that when Frederick died, he was leaving behind something that was stable, and he was leaving behind a legacy which could be continued continued completely seamlessly without breaking apart.
Exactly.
But that's not what's happening here with Hideyoshi. So the successors to Hideyoshi ended up being a group called the Council of Five Elders. And the Council of Five Elders, their responsibility was to take over as regents, because Hideyoshi had an heir. He had one kid, and that was a 5-year-old son. Keep in mind, he was in his 70s when he died.
Wow. He was in his 70s and he had a 5-year-old son?
He had a 5-year-old son. It was his only heir. I think he had one more son. I think he had 2 or 3 kids. But yeah, they were all like 5 years old or less, and he was in his 70s.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So this council was made up of his 5 most powerful vassals, which included Ieyasu. I'm not going to mention the other guys because none of them are important except for one guy. But as soon as Hideyoshi died, Ieyasu began to maneuver and make alliances with other powerful daimyos who rejected this 5-year-old boy's status as ruler. So shortly after the regency began, Ieyasu's main rival on the council was another daimyo named Maeda Toshie. This guy died as well. And Toshie was really the last major threat to any attempt at Ieyasu to make a seizure of power. So in 1599, he took his chance and he led his army to capture Osaka Castle. And they ended up taking Hideyori prisoner, the son. This, of course, sparked off another civil war with Ieyasu's forces on one side. They came to be known as the Eastern Army. And there was a Western Army of Toyotomi loyalists that were led by another daimyo named Ishida Mitsunari. So this part doesn't make a lot of sense, but try to follow me here.
That's typically my life, is I don't understand it, but I follow anyway.
Yeah. So as both sides were rallying their forces, Ieyasu's generals they tried to have Mitsunari assassinated, this other guy who they're about to fight against. But Mitsunari was able to escape the assassination attempt and ended up fleeing. When Ieyasu found out about it, he actually invited Mitsunari to one of his castles and offered to protect him from Ieyasu's own generals.
Wow, I'm kind of surprised.
Yeah. After so Ieyasu went, he gave all of his generals who were trying to do this a thorough dressing down. Just really chewed them out, handed them their own asses on a platter. After that, he let this guy go, this guy Mitsunari. He let him go so that he could command his armies against Ieyasu. So This has often been portrayed in popular stories about this period. It's often been portrayed as a demonstration of Ieyasu's sense of honor, that he can't tolerate the idea of killing an enemy through such underhanded means. But as we've established already, Ieyasu could not give less of a shit about honor in practice. What was probably actually happening was that Ieyasu knew Mitsunari personally. And more importantly, he had fought alongside Mitsunari in past wars under Hideyoshi. What I think was going on was that he wanted to fight an enemy that he was familiar with, somebody that he had fought alongside and knew how he fought and how he thought. Because if Mitsunari was in power in this enemy army, he knew how Mitsunari fought and he could predict what he would do. If somebody else was leading that army, there is no guarantee that he would know what it was that they would do, so he wouldn't be able to plan around that. That's what I think was kind of going on here.
Okay.
Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I hope I was explaining myself well. But so this war would end up actually not lasting very long. It was only a few months. So after a couple months of capturing forces, because they formed on, that's why they're called the Eastern and Western armies. That's for the parts of the country where they formed their armies. They started moving closer to the center of the country, capturing enemy fortresses as they went along, drifting closer and closer to the area kind of around central Japan, Kyoto, that area. The two armies met in Mino province at a place called Sekigahara. And the Battle of Sekigahara would end up being one of the most, if not the most, important battles in the history of Japan. And it should probably be counted amongst the most important battles in world history, alongside like Stalingrad and the Battle of Gaugamela. And
then why isn't it more known?
I don't know. It's Japanese. It's medieval Japanese history. Nobody in the West knows about medieval Japanese history.
That's kind of some BS. Not gonna lie.
Yeah. The Battle of Sekigahara should be one of those battles that everybody knows because of the insanely far-reaching effects that it has on human history. So the two sides were about evenly matched. They were about 80 to 90,000 troops on each side. They were fighting in the mud and the fog after a whole night of hard rain. The Western Army was having a bunch of trouble coordinating because a lot of the commanders really hated each other, it's something that if you're reading through like an hour by hour account of what was going on during this battle, it comes up over and over again. The Western Army, the army that Ieyasu was fighting, somebody would give an order for a flank to be reinforced or for a gap in the line to be filled, and whoever was being given the order would just refuse it and just sit on their ass, because whoever was giving the order, the subordinate just absolutely hated and despised and refused to listen to them.
I am not surprised at all.
Yeah, it happened over and over again over the course of this entire battle. So when portions of the Western Army line began to lose ground, they couldn't send reinforcements because some of the daimyo or another hated whoever was giving the command and refused to go. And so Ieyasu's forces were able to poke a few holes in Mitsunari's line. And after a few hours of fighting, the Western Army shattered and ran.
Not surprised at all.
Not surprised at all. During the retreat, thousands of soldiers were killed by the Eastern Army who were chasing after them, including many, many daimyos. A few more were captured. Some ended up committing seppuku. That's another one.
I wish you would have warned me because I did not have a shot already again.
I'm sorry. I forgot about it until I read it because it was right at the top of the second page on the screen. And so I didn't see it until my eyes drifted back up there.
Kampai.
Kampai. So many of the several daimyos were killed during the retreat. Some were captured. Some committed seppuku. One or two managed to escape. Ishida Mitsunari himself ended up being captured and executed on Ieyasu's orders. He wasn't even given the benefit or like the honor of being allowed to commit ritual suicide.
So was it the other version, the dishonorable one, or was it?
No, he was just killed.
Okay.
There's no suicide involved. He was just killed.
Wow.
Which is considered to be the most dishonorable way to die in Japanese warfare.
I'm sure.
So now we're in Japan. The year is 1600. Yeah, I think that's... Yeah, the year is 1600. Nobody is left in Japan except for Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Wow.
Through 40 years of political maneuvering and strategic brilliance on the battlefield, he has risen to become the undisputed ruler of Japan.
Holy crap, I didn't expect to go that way.
He set to work, and this is the third unification. There are 3 unifications of Japan. Oda Nobunaga broke the stalemate of the Sengoku period. Toyotomi Hideyoshi united all of the lands of Japan under a central leadership. And now Tokugawa Ieyasu is going to step in, and he's going to build the new Japanese government and social system that is going to ensure that Japan remains stable for the next 3 centuries.
How in the world is that possible?
We'll get into it. I'll explain a lot of it. I'll explain all of it. So, through 40 years of political maneuvering, strategic brilliance on the battlefield, he has risen to become the undisputed ruler of Japan. He immediately set to work taking over lands that were captured from the now dead or fleeing daimyos and handing over these lands to all of those that were loyal to him, which cemented his power and position. A few years later, after basically practicing this absolute power, on March 24th, 1603, the Emperor, remember he exists, the Emperor.
He doesn't do shit, though.
He doesn't do shit. Literally, what the Emperor is probably doing right now is just taking walks through his garden and writing poetry. That's all the Emperor does during this period of...
He's a figurehead at this point.
Yes.
Honestly, isn't he a figurehead until, like, World War II?
No, I'll actually get into when he stops being a figurehead. It involves the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate. So on March 24th, 1603, the Emperor Go-Yozei names Tokugawa Ieyasu as shogun.
Wow. I didn't realize he was going to be shogun.
Yep. And he becomes the first shogun, the founding shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate, a dynasty which would rule Japan for 260 years in a period...
260 years?
That period when he and his descendants ruled as the shoguns of Japan is what's called the Edo period.
Any reason why it's called Edo and not the Tokugawa, or however his name is pronounced?
Because his capital would be out of the city of Edo that he built, which would later become Tokyo.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, that makes so much more sense. I've heard of the Edo period. I just didn't realize it was related to Tokugawa.
Yeah, so the Tokugawa shogunate and the Edo period are more or less kind of concurrent. That's the same thing. Bear with me for a second. He would officially retire from his position 2 years later in 1605.
Only 2 years?
Okay, now let me explain. He left the seat to be filled by his son and heir, Tokugawa Hidetada. This was mostly an aesthetic change because he still held absolute power over the country after his quote unquote retirement. He just didn't want to deal with all of the ceremony that went with the title.
So essentially, he has told his son, "Hey, you're going to be in charge, but I'm going to tell you what to do."
Yes, that is literally what is happening.
Wow, that's the most Japanese thing I've ever heard in my life.
There were some more reasonable things that were going on, like he wanted to secure his succession before his death, that kind of thing. Some reasonable stuff, but I like to think that it had more to do with the fact that he didn't want to do like 3 or 4 tea ceremonies every time he wanted to talk to somebody in the government.
I hate that. That's so funny. Oh.
So, as leader of Japan, he invested heavily in fortresses and castles, as was natural. He was a military leader, especially the one that he built in his new capital of Edo. He started a bunch of expansions on it, and when it was finally finished, it wasn't actually finished being built until after his death. But when it was finally finished, it was the largest castle in the entire country, even bigger than the one in Kyoto that defended the literal emperor.
Wow, that's insane.
How
did he get away with that?
He was the shogun. The emperor didn't have any power. The shogun was the guy in charge.
I know, but I thought the fact that the emperor didn't have really power was a quote unquote secret. If you reinforce your city more than the emperor's city, that's gonna give it away. Why would you do that?
No. It wasn't a secret. Everybody knew the shogun had more power. It was openly talked about that the emperor was just like a spiritual leader more than an actual political leader.
Okay, I did not know that.
It wasn't. Everybody knew exactly what was going on. Everybody knew the shogun was the guy with the real power. It wasn't even. They didn't even treat they treated the shogun like they were supposed to be treating the emperor, supposedly by their own rules. They openly the shogun received all of the preferential treatment that the emperor ostensibly had, as far as politics and economics and basic power, how that worked. But yeah, as far as political reforms go, he made the position of the shogun almost completely autocratic. He stripped nearly all power away from other positions within the Japanese government and centralized all of them within the position of the shogun. Learning from the failures of the Imjin War in Korea, he pursued a policy of isolationism.
Explain the Imjin War with Korea briefly.
There was a war that was the invasion of Korea that Toyotomi Hideyoshi attempted.
Okay.
The failed invasion of Korea. It was called the Imjin War.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because it sounds like too much like Indian. I just wanted to make certain there was some clarification on that.
Yeah. No, it's IMJIN, not IN. Imgen, not Injin.
I just wanted to clarify it, as you would know.
No, I get it. But yeah, so learning from the failures of that war, Ieyasu pursued a policy of isolationism. He barred foreigners from entering the country.
Didn't that continue till basically World War II?
Yeah, I'll discuss that. So yeah, he barred foreigners from entering the country without explicit permission from the shogun himself. He, with one exception, he did allow the Dutch East India Company to operate a port in southern Japan.
Big mistake.
Yeah, in the city of Nagasaki, which is famous for something else I can't remember off the top of my head. But pretty much the Dutch were the only ones that were really even allowed in the country. And even then, they weren't allowed outside of Nagasaki. Most of the time, they weren't even allowed because their actual base was set up on an island off the coast of Nagasaki. They weren't even most of the time allowed in the city proper. So very, very exclusive. Also, in 1614, Ieyasu signed a law called the Christian Expulsion Edict, which expelled all European Christian missionaries from the country and also outlawed Christian worship.
That sounds very xenophobic, just like Japan.
Yeah, this is
Was this the beginning of their xenophobia, or did the xenophobia start before that?
this is the beginning of the institutionalization of Japanese xenophobia.
It's still very xenophobic, even if they don't want to admit it.
Oh yes, it is. It is still very, very. I would even venture to call it like its own unique form of racist.
Well, it's a very confusing form of racism because it's not necessarily the skin color, but yes, it does play a part. They're not so much worried about skin color as where your origins per se. Like, did you start in Japan? Did you do this in Japan? This, that, and the other. Because skin color wouldn't play a factor even if they had some, like, foreigner who was actually ethnically Japanese or whatever. Like, they would still be xenophobic against them.
Yeah, that's fair. I would say that that xenophobia does evolve into like something resembling like institutionalized racism when it comes to specifically Korean and Chinese people.
There's a very specific... they did some really heinous stuff to the Koreans. I don't know about the Chinese, but...
Oh, have you ever heard of the rape of Nanking?
Oh, I forgot you told me about that because I remember seeing them do that TikTok about that one book where they found images of the rape of Nanking at a pawn shop. That was insane that they actually found actual images of the rape of Nanking. Like, holy crap.
But yeah, there is a history of like legal institutionalized. I would venture to call it genuine legal racism in Japanese history. So yeah, Ieyasu in 1614 he signed the Christian Expulsion Edict into law, which expelled all Christian missionaries from the country and it also outlawed Christian worship. This was mainly done both because Christian groups were becoming a bit radical and disruptive in Japanese civil society, and also because around that same time the Spanish had just conquered the Philippines, and Ieyasu didn't want a bunch of Spanish priests running around his country making Japan vulnerable as the next target for European expansion.
Which is absolutely fair.
That's absolutely fair, but it does have a downside because this policy was, of course, very bloody. Lots of Japanese Christians, both...
How many policies back around then weren't bloody, though?
Literally none of them. None of them weren't bloody. But lots of Japanese Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, were killed by state repression, public executions, breaking up of masses, things like that. It also had the unintentional consequence of severely stunting foreign trade.
That's Japan's biggest issue is isolationism, where they cut themselves off.
Yeah, and this is kind of the start of that. All this meant that Japan had less markets to sell their good. Japanese merchants had less markets to sell their goods to, and they had less interaction with sort of the technological advancements of the West they had less access to a lot of those advancements. Less of them were making it into the country because they just didn't have the trade routes that would end up exposing them through like natural cultural osmosis to the technological developments. So the Japanese having less markets to sell their goods to, it meant they had less access to the technological and political advancements of the West. And that would end up having some pretty drastic long-term consequences. Also, in 1614, Ieyasu had a little itty-bitty war. So that that kid that I'd mentioned, that 5-year-old kid I mentioned earlier, by 1614, that kid, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the oldest son of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, or the oldest son of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, his name was Hideyori, when Ieyasu came to power. He's now a big adult grown-up now. And Hideyori was starting to get a little pissed off at the fact that he had been kind of denied what he thought was his birthright, which was heir to the leadership of the nation of Japan. And he was being a little itty bitty too loud about how much he didn't like this Tokugawa regime. And so Ieyasu decided to shut him up by besieging his castle at Osaka. So they besieged the castle for a year.
A year? Holy crap!
A whole year. Tokugawa troops finally led an assault. They finally launched an assault and broke into the castle. And so Hideyori and his mother, Hideyoshi's widow, were both ordered to perform ritual suicide.
Kanpai.
Toyotomi Hideyori was forced to commit seppuku. And also, during that last final attack, Hideyori's infant son was killed. The baby. I'd prefer not. I didn't find any details on how exactly the baby died. I'd rather not think about it, honestly.
Killing a child is disgusting, no matter what point of history it's in.
Yeah, I don't even know if the baby was probably killed. It's not guaranteed, but
definitely the baby was killed.
Might have even been on Ieyasu's orders too. We're not sure though. That the historians don't seem too keen to give details about how a baby dies.
Would you be, if you were historian in charge of this, would you feel comfortable disclosing that?
I wouldn't feel comfortable, but I would do it in the interest of knowledge. That's just me. Hideyori, his mother, and his infant son were all killed during this attack, which meant that after all this, there were no heirs to the Toyotomi clan left, and the clan died with them. So that's the...
Unfortunately.
For his whole life, Ieyasu had been an avid falconer, like I said. But as he aged, he wasn't able to handle the physical stresses involved with the sport. And so, to pass the time, he ended up diving into philosophy and theology instead, and became an ardent follower of Confucianism.
When did Confucianism come about? Because I knew it was a big thing, but I don't know the origin point. Like, time-wise.
I think it was the Chinese Warring States period, which would have been like the 600s BC.
Wow, that's earlier than I expected.
Yeah, it's most of the Chinese philosophies are over 2,000 years old.
Really?
Yeah, Taoism, Confucianism, legalism, all of those are very, very...
What's legalism?
Ieyasu's whole life, he'd been an avid falconer, but as he aged, he wasn't really quite able to handle the physical stresses involved in the sport. So he dove into philosophy and theology instead, especially Confucianism. He wrote several books, including an autobiography and a few works on Confucian ethics, which is really funny considering how unethical his entire life was.
You're right, but do continue.
Finally, in 1616, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the undisputed leader of Japan, the last and greatest of the three great unifiers, and the founder of one of Japan's most enduring and formative dynasties, died in his bed at the age of 73, either from cancer or from syphilis, depending on who you ask.
Where did the syphilis come from?
No idea. He was probably sleeping around.
Makes sense.
For some reason, old guys in Japan like to sleep around. I don't get it.
Old men in Japan like to sleep around, even today.
His remains were buried in the Gongen's mausoleum in Kunozen, a shrine in the city of Shizuoka. There's a persistent popular rumor in Japan that on the first anniversary of his death, his remains were removed and reburied at another shrine in the town of Nikko.
That's weird. That's suspicious.
Both shrines have grave markers to him, and neither one of those shrines have agreed to have their respective graves exhumed in order to confirm which one he's buried in.
Well, of course not.
So we still don't know where his body is now.
That makes sense.
In accordance with his wishes, and this is where we get into some of the egomaniac sort of shit. In accordance with his wishes, after his death, he was deified.
He was deified?
He was deified.
How?
He was deified in the Shinto Buddhist faith, and he's now revered in the Shinto religion as a pseudo-messianic figure. And he has shrines all over Japan dedicated to him. In Japan, the dominant religion is Shinto Buddhism, which is kind of a mix of the native animist religion mixed with Buddhism. Yeah, they see him as a reincarnation of both like a war god and of the Buddha.
That's a weird mixture.
Yes. I don't know how popularly accepted that interpretation of his life is, or of his legacy is, within the Shinto religion, but there are shrines to him all over Japan.
That makes sense. They have shrines for basically everything in Japan.
That is fair, yes. But he does have a prominent place within the Shinto religion in Japan. You wanna know the weirdest part is? Modern Shinto religion is based heavily on Shin Buddhism, which was the sect of Buddhism.
What's the difference between Buddhism and Shin Buddhism?
You remember the Ikko that I talked about earlier, the Ikko rebels, the pseudo-anarchists?
Barely.
They were Shin Buddhists. They believed that nirvana that people were able to achieve nirvana within this life, and it didn't require reincarnation.
Okay.
Yeah, so modern Shinto is based heavily on traditional Shin Buddhism, which is the inspiring religion for the Ikko movement, which was violently suppressed by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who modern Shin Buddhists now revere.
Makes sense.
So, kind of this complicated. So the dynasty that he founded, the Tokugawa Shogunate, would rule for 260 years, an era of history now called the Edo period, named after the fishing village where Ieyasu founded his capital city. His successors would uphold his policy of isolation, and Japan would remain nearly airtight and separated from the rest of the world during that whole time. As the world became dominated by European colonialism and revolution shook apart the old foundations of global politics, as technology advanced and the world outside reshaped into something far beyond medieval feudalism, Japan remained comparatively stationary.
Makes sense compared to where Japan prefers to see itself.
The shogun ruled, the daimyos obeyed, the commoners worked, the emperor wrote poetry and went for walks in the garden, and things were relatively calm and stable. That would all change shockingly quickly when, in 1854, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy rolled into Edo Harbor with a group of gunships, fired off a few blanks from the ship's cannons, and told the officials there that they would be coming to open up trade with Japan, with the heavy implication that if they refused, the next shots wouldn't be blanks.
Wow.
Now that Japan was open to trade, not just from the US, but from France and the UK as well, Japan rapidly began adopting modern technology like trains, telegraph, industrial factories, and of course, weaponry. The sudden shock of foreign modernization to Japanese society had drastic political consequences.
I'm not surprised.
typically what happens. Within a decade, a faction of daimyos and samurai emerged in the country, advocating for the rejection of foreign money while adopting modern technology in order to make Japan autonomous and competitive in this new age of colonialism. To do this, they advocated for the abolition of the Tokugawa shogunate and the restoration of the power of the emperor, who, again, still existed and was still a figurehead puppet. In 1868, the Boshin War, also called the Japanese Civil War, broke out, which ended a year later with what came to be called the Meiji Restoration, when imperial forces defeated the shogun and replaced him with the restored Emperor Meiji, leader of the resurgent Empire of Japan. And of course, we all know how that turned out. A little bit of Korean and Chinese blood and a couple of nuclear bombs. That's how that whole project ended. The last descendant of Tokugawa Ieyasu, or the last descendant of Ieyasu to rule over China or over Japan, he was overthrown in 1867. His name was Tokugawa Yoshinobu. After he was overthrown and relinquished his power to the emperor, he retired and spent his life split between working as a political advisor to various politicians throughout Japan and relaxing to his hobbies before dying in 1913. The Tokugawa family still lives on to this day, despite not having political power anymore. The current living head of the House of Tokugawa is a man named Tokugawa Ieyasu. He was born in 1965. He's an economist with a doctorate in economics from the University of Michigan.
That's insane. He has a Western degree.
Yeah. He makes a living translating English books on economics into Japanese. And he has previously worked for the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And he's currently a member of the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, which makes him technically more or less a social democrat, interestingly enough.
Wow.
And that's it. That's what I have on Tokugawa Ieyasu.
Wow. This is an interesting episode, not gonna lie.
I really enjoyed this episode. This was a good topic. I'm glad I did this one. Real quick, my main source was a book called Shogun, The Life of Tokugawa Ieyasu by A.L. Sadler. And then I used various different articles from Nat Geo, Encyclopedia Britannica as like general outlines, stuff like that. But that was the main one. Anyways, what did you think about this, Dan? What did you think about this whole topic, about this guy's life?
As someone who is like a big fan of Japanese culture and whatever, without being like the person who looks into the technical details or like very deep into historical stuff, like I love anime, I love toku, I love a lot of Japanese stuff. It gave a lot of insight that I didn't know was necessary.
Yeah, I get what you're saying about like the sort of it does provide a lot of context for kind of where modern Japan, a lot of the attitudes and the cultural norms that a lot of Westerners like us kind of find quirky or weird, or
it explains why they want to keep society where it's at, because they want to keep a norm or they want to keep a status quo is the best way I can say it.
Yeah,
because there's historically, even if modern Japanese people haven't dealt with it, they're used to such an upheaval that keeping the status quo now is more easy than trying to deal with a change to modern society.
And especially in like towards the end of the Edo period, it makes a lot of sense like where their traditionalism sort of comes from, because they were kind of violently dragged kicking and screaming into the modern world. And so
violently doesn't even describe it.
For what it's worth, the Japanese nation did very well adapting to the trends and the climate of the 19th and 20th centuries. They did very well for themselves, setting them up.
It only took nuclear weapons.
Yeah, it literally took nukes to get them to stop being as good as Europeans are at conquering and murdering people. I think they took the lessons that they imported from Europe a little bit too seriously. But yeah, you can still see like a lot of, as a culture, the Japanese people still are kind of traumatized from that whole like 260 years of isolation immediately going into being thrust into global geopolitics, thrown into a civil war, the complete upheaval of your political system, into an imperial age of complete domination, and then the sudden catastrophic collapse of that system as you go into the 20th century. That it makes a lot of sense why what a lot of Westerners find quirky about Japanese culture and society, why that kind of happened.
You're not wrong. You're completely on track. It's just it's hard to believe that they weren't able to let go by now, but I feel like that's a Western idea of being able to let it go.
Yeah, it's easy for Americans who our history is as old as the entire Japanese Edo period. They have a history going back 2,000 years. And so it's easy for us to say, oh, it's like we don't even have a history that's all that old, and our country still has a really bad problem of sticking too much to the past. I can't even imagine what it'd be like for a people like the Japanese who have such an ancient culture and ancient history, and for such recent history to them within just a few generations, having it be so turbulent and violent. It makes sense.
It does. It does. Any final thoughts before we go, Derek?
No, nothing for me. Tim, where can I find the pod's social media?
Well, first, where can they find you?
They can find me at Visigoth. The first I is a 1, the O is a 0.
They can find me at Twitter at Tim, aka Otis, but they can also find the podcast at Alex Society Pod on Twitter and the Alexander Society Pod on Facebook and Instagram. If they enjoyed what they listened to today, they can leave us a rate and review on their streaming platform of choice. And that's all I've got to say. How about you, Derek?
Bye.